from the Somme Fjord area, which is north of Bergen. And the Somme Fjord is absolutely beautiful. And on one of my visits, my sister and my mother and I visited relatives there, and it turns out that her cousin's wife, my mother's cousin's wife, was the bunad maker for the area. So my sister and I both ordered costumes. This represents a sword. You've always got to protect yourself. This is called a loose pocket, and it connects onto the belt. You'll note that the Somme costume has a lot of silver. They don't all have this much silver. And that's why I was a little concerned that I couldn't find the box. But we found it, thank goodness. Down at the bottom, you see ripples and what appear to be mountains. And that is to represent the Somme area, which has lots of rivers, lots of mountainous area. It's stitched, everything is stitched by hand. This is all by hand. It has a, if you look in the costume book, it has a humongous white, ugly looking hat for the married women, and I chose not to buy that. And I kind of regret that now, but oh, it would have been a real hardship to try to keep it clean.
And so she was kind enough to let me demonstrate this beautiful, exquisite costume, and also just tell you about my connection with Norway, which is through my mother. And I'm just going to borrow my notes because my mind often leaves me. But my mother was the eldest of 5 daughters, born in eastern Pennsylvania. And they said it was pretty much of a sight when those 5 kids were all dressed up, sitting in the open car, driving with their Sunday best on. And I love to keep that image. So here is a picture of my mother. She's the second oldest with her, a lot of girls in that family. So unfortunately, my grandfather died when he was in his 40s. And so the 5 girls were sort of, all of a sudden had to grow up and go out on their own. And my mother was the, waited the longest to get married and traveled the farthest. So she moved to Washington, D.C. and joined Red Cross and was then stationed in Oslo for 2 years. Cross country, but you can see Troll, though that's original. So these are from the 40s, and you know, they're ready to go. And then these are her reindeer cross-country shoes. And my next door neighbor married a woman from Belgium, and one Christmas, when it looked like Norway in Ohio, they came over and she was wearing reindeer shoes. And I don't think I said this, but I'm thinking, I have these pair of shoes in my attic. So what would be the chances? But anyway, they're ready to go.
17th Mai means 17th of May, and that is when Norway actually gained its independence. There are parades all over the country. Now, you may not know that, but I know there's a parade in Brooklyn because I've seen it. I know there's a parade in Seattle because I've seen it in a nearby suburb. There are Norwegians all over this country, but the majority of them are in the Midwest, and Minnesota has the most. And if you've ever been there, you even detect a little bit of a Norwegian accent. I call it Minnesota nice. They're just really nice people back there. I lived there for many years, even though I grew up in Iowa. My background, my father's family, as I mentioned, came in the 1840s. So long ago that we haven't been able to keep touch with them. My mother's family, her mother came in the 1870s to Wisconsin and then on to South Dakota. Her husband, well then she went back to Wisconsin and met her husband, who was evidently my grandfather. I didn't know him. He died before I was born. But he actually came from Norway. He was one of 6 or 7 sons. They lived on a rocky farm, and they couldn't make a living. So one by one, the sons came to America. That poor mother begged the youngest son, Johann, please stay, don't all of you desert me, because of course she never saw them again. So the youngest one stayed, and we're so thankful because we have reconnected with them, and I know them very well, and I've visited them many times. My grandfather ended up, they were all sort of sponsored by somebody. They're Norwegians, and he saved and worked for many years for another Norwegian farmer, got enough money to buy his own farm in Iowa, and so that's where he raised his family, and that's where my mother grew up. So, if you talk about the Midwest, Wisconsin, North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, there are many, many, many Scandinavian people. The Swedes and the Danes also, and the Finns also ended up there a little bit. I want to thank Carolyn very much. Is it working, Carolyn?
Is it still up there?
Yay, okay. Anyway, she has helped me with another program, and I know she does a terrific job. So we'll kind of start through some photos, but I'll give you a little introduction. I have things, but I'm probably not going to follow this. I'll get it ready though in case I forget something. So let's start with the first slide. A Viking, and a very fierce-looking Viking. Does anybody recognize this Viking?
Yeah.
I know Mary Beth is nodding her head. And who might this be? That's my second son. Claire Del Schreiber described him as the ham in the middle of the sandwich. And he's always been a little bit like that. We took a trip, it was probably my last trip to Norway. And Marcus, my oldest son Matt, and his wife and children, and we visited a reproduction of a longhouse. They had done some archaeological work and they discovered the remains of a longhouse that had been inhabited by Vikings. And it's a hands-on museum. So you can dress in costume, and of course, Marcus was right there, ready to go. I hope you'll forgive me for showing that. But it makes me wonder, how did these horrible people, I mean, they're glamorized now and they're on TV and everything, Vikings. They were not nice people. They were raiders and plunderers and murderers and, oh my goodness, how did they evolve to one of the most gentle, kindliest countries in the world? And they are known for their peace giving. It's actually very much of a socialist country. One of those little clues, who had that clue about the government had trillions of dollars which they set aside, and so now everybody gets, medical care, and they get time off to have babies, they get this, they get that, they get this, but everybody gets it, and it's just a happy country. It's known as one of the happiest, most pleasant countries in Europe. And actually, Oslo is considered one of the best cities in Europe. So, how did they evolve? Well, it's curious, and I'm not quite sure. But on the table, I have a series of 3 books. Now, some of you know Chris Evans. Chris was named Kristen, K-R-I-S-T-I-N, and she's going to be a speaker later this year, for the character in this trilogy of books. I had bought it at the AUW book sale years ago, and I thought this might be interesting. Well, I just never got around to reading it. But Chris inspired me. So this summer, I managed to slog through all 3 of them, and anybody who wants to borrow them can. The names did not bother me all that much because I'm familiar with a lot of those names. I grew up with those names, and a lot of sons and daughters. Your daughter of so-and-so, so your so-and-so's daughter, Laudenslager. She was Kristen Laudenslager. So those names didn't bother me, but I wondered. Now, Wendy mentioned World War II. Norway was very active in securing safe passage for Jewish people in World War II. It doesn't get the credit because there was a very awful man. Why is a country blamed for 1 or 2 men? We don't know. But the people of Norway were active in finding secret passages because they were mountainous and people could come over the mountains. They did the same thing for Russian people trying to escape. during the Cold War. It is so remote in parts of Norway that, I mean, you just don't see people for miles and miles and miles. At any rate, I think we can move on to the next one. Now, this is Velkommen til Storten, and this is the 17. Mai that I first attended. This town is just incredible. I don't know if they do it so much now, but they have parades where they have floats, they have Norwegian dancers that are fantastic. I have a carved wooden one over there on the table. They do these dances that are historic and it's just so much fun to watch. You'd rather be a Norwegian dancer in Stoughton than anything else in high school. It's a real prestigious thing to get that honor. They have troll contests. They have bunad display. Linda and I modeled our bunads one year. It's just fun, food. And so I was just enraptured and I thought, wow, this is so nice. So David, at the end of that weekend said, well, I'm going to marry you. And I said, yeah, right. I don't even know you. And we went on our ways, but we did end up getting engaged. Imagine that. And it was a long, happy marriage. Next slide, please. Here is a young Julie. Okay, she's engaged, but she's already planned a trip to Europe. And she thinks, oh my, I will probably never get to go to Europe again in my life. And David said, well, why don't you go? Go have fun, and we'll take care of your mother and I will plan the wedding while you're gone. And they did. I tried on 2 wedding dresses, bought the first one. They did everything else. So I came home and got married. But it was my first experience in Norway. I did meet one of the relatives at that time. And so I kept in touch. So David and I married, and we moved after his stint in the Navy and a little short stint in Vietnam. We moved to Wooster, Ohio. And we would often celebrate 17. Mai by hanging both flags. I still have both flags. I don't have a place. Now I just have the American one because Rotary does that for me. But we do wear our bunads on special occasions. This was the occasion of my son Matt's confirmation. My mother in the background, Matt, my sister Linda with the same bunad, of course, they're from the same area, and my mother-in-law, Marie, who was from a different area of Norway.
That's beautiful.
Okay, second trip to Norway. I went with my husband and children when they were teenagers. And of course, everybody has to stop in Oslo and see the famous Viking ship that was uncovered. How many of you have been to Norway? Okay, it's a popular place, we know that. But I'm gonna tell you, I think I've been a few more places probably than you have. But Oslo, of course, you always wanna go see Oslo. And who can tell me what this is? It is also in Oslo, and this is the actual Kon-Tiki. Remember the Kon-Tiki? Thor Heyerdahl, who did his famous trip. And this park, this is all in Oslo, with all the statues, the little angry boy, all the carved statues. It's an amazing park. Norway is famous for very, very many artists. It's a very artistic, I think, what is there to do in the old days? So they became painters and carvers and musicians. We heard Grieg earlier, and famous artists. Munch, Edvard Munch. Some of you might be familiar with the Scream. That's probably his most famous one. This is also a famous one. On my last trip, they were having a special Munch exhibit in a museum. Munch was very depressed, always. I found his work very, very gloomy. This is a mother and a daughter. They've lost a loved one, and they're in mourning. And he was just, I find, very dark. But very good. Okay, now, do we recognize this? Have you gone beyond Oslo? Bergen, of course. And Pearl, by the way, has a son-in-law who is Norwegian, and I'm sure you are very familiar with Norway and its customs. Bergen is an enchanting village. It's not a village, it's quite a large town. It's one of my very favorite places. It was a Hanseatic seaport. They did a lot of trade with people all over the world. Its buildings are unique and very distinctive. The streets are very narrow, like you will find in many areas. My son Marcus, the Viking, you saw earlier, was a Rotary student in Sweden. And he managed to get assigned, of all things, to Sweden. Well, if you know the background, and it's political and it goes way, way back, Norway and Sweden have not always gotten along really well. There's a little bit of a friction there. Norway was under the rule of Sweden until 1905 when they declared their freedom. So, going to Sweden as an exchange student, oh my, and his family said, oh, we have an American who's a Norwegian background. Well, they are wonderful. And I've, visited with them many times as well. And the last time was with Brian, and they said, Brian, Brian, Brian. And I call him Marcus and Brian because his name is Marcus Brian, and in college he chose to go by Marcus. But his mom still forgets. And they forgot, and they said, Brian, 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 your room is waiting for you. You know, it's just a very, very good relationship. And I loved touring Gotland with Brian. I saw lots and lots of old, abandoned, middle-aged, vintage, or whatever you would say, circa, churches. The shells of churches and castles. And of course, Norway was Catholic. And after Martin Luther spread throughout that area, it became Lutheran. One interesting fact, looking up in Wikipedia and so forth on the internet now, 85% of the people in Norway are still Lutheran. The other 15% is every other religion. Every other religion is represented. But guess what the second largest at 3.7 is? Muslim. Okay, next one. And this is happening all over Europe, I might add. Okay, this was our second trip, or maybe my second trip there, with the children. And we are just taking the path up to my cousin's house. This was in February. I've been there at every season of the year, and let me tell you, yes, they do get a lot of snow. Okay, next one. The relatives could not be happier to see people from America. A lot of them have come to visit us as well. But look at them, and I show this picture because I love that their chairs, they're carved and painted with the rosemall. You see a lot of wood in Norway. It's just so available. I think one of those statistics said they were one of the first countries to ban cutting trees. They love their wood. And the women are preparing a smorgasbord. Smorgasbord means smorgas, open-faced sandwiches generally. Sometimes it's hot and cold food. Board is table. So you have all this food laid out on a table, and you could just eat and eat and eat. Now, then we went to visit some of David's relatives in Balestrand, which is still in the Sogn area. We kind of hoped that we weren't related way back when, but I don't think there's any evidence of that. It's a little bit ways away. This is a 7-month-old baby and a cat. And this is on their deck, a lovely home with a large deck in February. And it's the little baby's mother, Hannah, who is now a grown woman, said, her mother said, oh, she needs her daily air. You know, you've got to have fresh air. So out goes Hannah for I forget how long now on this deck. Anyway, that's just very common. They love the out of doors. Then we visited some of David's relatives in Oslo, a lovely musician. And Annie was taking violin at the time. She wanted to encourage her, but I think Annie was a little embarrassed about it because this woman is a professional. I see the white furniture, light colored. They like to make their homes light and bright because of the dark, dark, dark days they get so much of the year. Now, my third trip was with my mother and my sister, and we had a fabulous time. She was able to go back and visit the home place of her father. And here she is. You notice how it's painted a lovely color and so forth. But as I said, it wasn't enough to support 7 big, strong boys and their families. So we're glad she came to America. But my mother had the best time. And she got to visit with her cousin who was still alive. 2 or 3 of the cousins, I think, were still alive. This is in Balestrand, and this is one of my favorite hotels. Have anybody been to that? Art everywhere. You see carving, all this carving, all the rose mulling, all the painting. It's just really a beautiful, beautiful place. We didn't stay there. We stayed in another hotel that was less expensive, but we visited it. Now, this is a Stav church. Norway is famous, probably the only country in the world that has this particular type of church. It's similar in a way to am I blocking you, patient? To an Asian one, but you have dragons and strange gargoyles and things carved at the top. But that's all wood, and they date back to the Middle Ages. When we lived on Cleveland Road, we built a gazebo, and we had a good friend, Hans Tanoff, who was a carpenter with Bogners, and he was the best. He was just meticulous. And he built a Stav-roofed gazebo. It's still standing. Every shingle on that roof is made from wood and hand done by Hans. I wish I could have moved it with me. This is another church, and a very famous church. This is in Trondheim. Are some of you familiar with the St. Olaf Choir? That was one of my goals in life when I was young. I wanted to visit Alaska. I wanted to see the Lippensonner Stallions, and I wanted to hear the concert, the St. Olaf concert at Christmas at St. Olaf, and I did manage to get all 3 fulfilled. But our trip, this isn't just a postcard. Our trip, my last trip, was into the Trondheim Cathedral. The St. Olaf Choir has sung there. And oftentimes at Christmas, that concert is reproduced, or shown again, I should say, on television. It is a magnificent Middle Ages, late cathedral. This is part of the rose window and part of the artwork inside. Now, in Trondheim, there is a university, and I know there was a local woman who, Sheila Naylor, and I think Mike's son was a teacher there. I'm not sure that he still is. He married a Norwegian girl and he moved to Norway. I know he was a professor there. But a typical college. And I thought, Coca-Cola everywhere. You know? And they have a statue, I think that's a St. Olaf up there. And every year they put that red cap on him. Then with my family when kids were teenagers, then with my mother and sister. And the last trip, the 4th trip, as I said, was with my adult children. And we traveled way far north. We flew, we took the train, we took the bus, and we went way up in Luften, which is very remote, and there are only small fishing villages. We stayed on a weekend, and we did not realize that the stores closed on the weekend. We had no food. And so we said to the man who we were renting a cute little house, and we said, where do we get food? Oh, you should have bought it yesterday. They close on Saturday and Sunday. Well, they very kindly gave us some salmon, such as you ate today, and bread, and we were fine. I guess we had a few nibblies with us. But fish, of course. And once somebody told me that the only thing Norway is famous for is fish. Well, it obviously is famous for many things. But for many years, it was famous for fish. These are drying racks. And some fish drying. Now, you had some lefse today. And 2 different ways to eat it. My family likes it with the sugar. I don't usually put cinnamon. I put a little cinnamon in this to jazz it up a little. But just butter and sugar. That's how my family likes it. But it can be used with fish inside. And my mother would always eat it with lutefisk. Now, have you ever heard of lutefisk? It's a Scandinavian joke. People either hate it or they love it. It is cod that has been dried and then reconstituted in a lye solution. Have you ever eaten it?
My daughter has. Once.
Well, yeah. I think that was me once, but Mother always ordered at the stores at home. Of course, we're so many Scandinavians. You always had a special cheese you got in at Christmas, and you got lutefisk. And she'd boil it, and then she'd put all kinds of butter, and she'd wrap it in her lefse. Last visit, my very dear second, third cousin, Toril, invited us over for lunch, and she had her grandchildren there, and she served hot dogs. Now, hot dogs can be served in lefse, and so you had a little wee one today with mustard. My children and grandchildren are all vegetarians. But they were polite, and she also had, in our honor, because she thought all Americans ate hot dogs, and then she also had made a squash soup, because she thought that sounded American. So we survived, and we did fine. Now this is the villages. All right, giving a little bit. And I'm not going to, with a lot of pictures with the mountains, but they are so incredible, and the fjords are so incredible. And you can see the brightly painted houses, which they love to do. Okay, next please. Another view looking down. Another interesting church. This was an English-American church, and it was open, and we could just go in and quietly pray, and it was just a very lovely. Some of their architecture is really unique, and a lot of architects are, well, I should say, a lot of Norwegians are architects, and I think it's the draw to the wood and the designing with the wood, possibly. Now, this is the longhouse I talked about. This has been reconstructed on the site, and they found enough evidence to learn how big they were. They indeed were very, very long. Okay. Inside, they're supported by central poles. It's quite dark, but roomy. Several families would live in one. They were showing us different crafts. This man is carving wood. They had games. The Vikings were not illiterate or uneducated. They were just mean. But they did have a lot of different games and things, and they also had some beautiful work. Of course, they might have stolen that. I don't know. And another game that you could play. So it was a hands-on museum, which is a very fun way to do it. Here's a menu just to show you. They picture a lot because they do get a lot of visitors. So you have it oftentimes in English and in Norwegian. Most Norwegians do speak English. Some of the remote areas possibly not, but a lot of fish you can see pictured here. Okay. I was thinking of maybe serving you mutton and cabbage, which is one of the main meals, but I didn't do that today. Here are my boys, and we are now visiting my husband's family, David's family in Balestrand. This is the church where his family had gone to church. And we visited a lot of the graves with the name Menes. Menes is spelled M-E-N-E-S in Norway, and it means there is a mountain, and it is from this area. So not everybody named Menes is related. They did a lot of that in Norway also. You took the name of the area where you were from. As you can see here. Now, this is my cousin Toril, who I had mentioned. This is on the first visit. I'm going to show you a later picture of her. Our first visit when my children were young, and we were tromping through the snow, we stayed with Toril. She was the principal at an elementary school. Her husband was an architect. Anyway, Toril took us to her school. These are all costumes. They are getting ready to do Midsummer's Night. in this elementary school, they were doing Shakespeare. And she has all the costumes ready. Up here are candles burning. I was just amazed. They had candles, live candles, burning in an elementary school. Unheard of. It went fine. They're used to it. They have, everybody has candles. This is Toril and her husband Arthur in their later years, retired, and she had us for that lunch that I just mentioned. Wonderful people. Now, which ones are American and which ones are Norwegian? Kind of hard to tell, isn't it? We were staying with the family this year of this girl. Her mother was a doctor who had known my daughter-in-law Marcy and worked with her in Cleveland. And so she said, you are going to stay with us when you get to Bergen. So we stayed with them this time. So this is not a relative. But these children are fourth cousins. Okay, my granddaughter, Toril's granddaughter, Toril's granddaughter, my granddaughter. All blonde and blue-eyed, and they look very much alike. Okay. And finally, here we are out on the water with the mountains in the background, and I loved it. Brian we rented a little boat, and out we went, and it was cold, but it was so much fun. So, to America is my journey, and back to Norway. And it's been a real pleasure. Each time I've gone, I've learned a little bit more, and I've done something slightly different. I recently did 23andMe. How many of you have done that? Well, it was no surprise, really. I am like 86% Norwegian, but I am also Irish and English. Those Vikings did get around. They did. Okay. And to end, another beautiful sunset. And finally, this is what they're famous for.
Have you seen
The midnight sun, and I've never been fortunate to be there. Has anybody been there to see it? Have you, Carol?
In the Yukon Territory in Alaska, or in
Okay.
Canada.
In Canada.
Alaska.
Well, it
And
must be
it looks
just,
like that.
yeah, it must be just incredible. And daylight all day, and
Well, we were there,
Well-
it was actually the end of August and 1st of September is when we saw it. So, you know, the days were getting a little bit shorter. But yeah, it
Well-
looked just like that.
it must be absolutely wonderful. Maybe there will be a fifth trip in me someday. I don't know. The other kids want to go, so we'll see. Okay, that's it. And just in conclusion, I think I do value and treasure my heritage now, much more than I did growing up. But my daughter, Annie, and she had no idea I was giving this program, and I had no idea what she was doing. But her son, Axel Magnus, Axel is a Norwegian name, named for a skater who invented the triple axel, the double axel in skating. Magnus, just because it's an old Norwegian name. And my dad's initials were AM, so he is AM, Axel Magnus. Well, Axel's in kindergarten, and his teachers said they're studying all kinds of different countries. So the letter came home. If any of you have a heritage you want to share. So Annie prepared a lesson. She copied pictures of trolls, and she had them coloring, and she brought some, she said, I didn't bake anything, Mom, but I bought some ginger cookies. And she went to school, and she had a really fun time. So I'm glad to see that it's being passed on to another generation. Axel is half Jewish as well, so he's got a wealth of tradition behind him, and he'll celebrate all of them. Anyway, are there any questions? Yes, Wendy.
I was just gonna say, Annie's an architect, right?
Annie is, yeah.
Yeah. And I recently learned that Norway has the longest amount of shoreline of any country, 63,000 miles.
Because of all the fields.
Any comments about those little trivial facts I was sharing with you? Did anybody, I love this one, did anybody get the one that they have knighted a red penguin? I have no idea what the background is behind that, but I thought that was kind of interesting. Well, I thank you again, Carolyn, and I thank all of you for coming, and I certainly thank the co-hostesses, Clara Ann and Patient, who wasn't even listed as one. And thank you all for coming. And there's plenty more food. Please, I have little Ziploc bags if you want to take anything home with you. So thank you.